Rumors from the west. The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause. It rolled down the blackened ruins of Aachen and pooled in craters where shells had once bloomed like iron flowers. Every street was a graveyard now, of men, of homes, of faith. The air smelled of mud, diesel, and rot, as though the whole earth had begun to decay. Corporal Hans Meyer crouched behind a broken wall, his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon blur into the same dull shade of gray as the sky. Somewhere out there, the Americans were coming. He could feel it in the ground, the low tremor that never stopped, like the pulse of something vast and inevitable. His boots were soaked through. His hands were raw from cold. The once proud uniform of the Wehrmacht hung loose around his frame. Hunger had carved out his cheeks, and exhaustion had taken what the cold had not. Around him, the remnants of his unit, men who once believed they could conquer the world, sat in silence, their faces hollow. Private Ernst Vogel, barely 20 and still clinging to a boy's nervous smile, broke the quiet. "Corporal," he said, his voice muffled by the rain, "they say the Americans took Cologne yesterday." Hans didn't answer. He had stopped believing what they said a long time ago. The Reich's words were like old bullets. They'd lost their power, but they still wounded anyone foolish enough to believe in them. When Ernst spoke again, his voice was smaller. "Do you think it's true?" Hans turned his eyes toward the horizon, not to look, but to think. "If the Americans took Cologne," he said quietly, "then we're already ghosts. We just haven't lain down yet." The young man went silent. The rain filled the space between them. Everywhere Hans looked, there were reminders of what used to be home: the burnt-out frame of a farmhouse, a bicycle tangled in barbed wire, a child's doll half buried in the mud. Once, this had been Germany. Now it was just a wound. He took out a small notebook from his coat, the pages wrinkled from moisture. With trembling fingers, he wrote a single line before closing it again. "If the devils have mercy, then who are we?" That afternoon, the refugees came, civilians staggering east from the ruined towns. Their faces were pale and hollow, eyes glazed with the shock of survival. Hans gave them water from his canteen, though he had little to spare. One old woman, her hair white and wild beneath a torn scarf, stopped before him. She clutched a child close to her chest. "They're not like you," she whispered. Hans frowned. "Who?" "The Americans," she said. "They let us go. They told us to take the road east before they shelled the town. They didn't want to kill us." For a long moment, Hans couldn't speak. The words didn't fit the stories he'd been told. In Berlin, they said the Americans were butchers, that they burned villages and tortured prisoners. But this woman spoke of mercy. He nodded once, quietly. "Go on," he said. "There's nothing left for you here." She didn't thank him. She simply walked away, her figure fading into the mist, the child's cry muffled by the rain. Hans watched until she vanished. Something heavy shifted inside him. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the armor he'd built around his belief. That night, the company huddled in what remained of a church. The roof had collapsed long ago, leaving only charred beams reaching into the dark sky like broken ribs. Captain Ritter, their commanding officer, stood near the altar, his uniform stiff with mud and his voice trembling as he read from a telegram. "By order of the Fuhrer," he said, "no German soldier shall retreat before the American advance. Cowardice will be met with immediate execution." No one saluted. No one even moved. The men stared at the ground, listening to the rain striking the remnants of stained glass. Finally, Sergeant Otto, an old veteran with eyes like cracked glass, muttered, "Then we'll have to choose which bullet kills us, theirs or ours." A few men laughed, not out of humor, but from something close to madness. Hans sat silently. He looked up at the remains of a painted Christ above the altar. The face was gone, obliterated by shrapnel, leaving only the outstretched hands. "Maybe surrender isn't cowardice," he whispered. "Maybe it's salvation." By morning, rumors had spread again, this time among the soldiers themselves. Some said the Americans had promised food to prisoners, others that they treated captives well, even allowed letters home. The old propaganda machine could no longer drown those whispers. Then came a strange sound, a voice drifting through the trees. At first, they thought it was wind. But then the words became clear, spoken in perfect German. German soldiers, you are surrounded. Lay down your arms. You will be treated humanely. The war is lost. Save your lives. The men froze. The voice came again, calm and even. No anger, no hatred. Ernst stared toward the woods. It's them, he whispered. Sergeant Otto spat in the mud. American lies. Hans shook his head. Lies don't sound like mercy. They listened again. The voice didn't command. It reasoned. It didn't shout. It asked. When it faded, the forest seemed emptier for its absence. Hans felt something he hadn't felt in months, confusion. Not from fear, but from doubt. The kind that burned worse than hunger. That night, the fire burned low. The men spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid their words would summon punishment. We can't keep this up, Ernst said. There's no food. No fuel. Half the men have frostbite. Otto grunted. Orders are orders. Orders from who? Hans asked softly. Berlin's in ruins. The Führer sends ghosts to fight his battles now. No one answered. The fire crackled, and for a moment, it sounded like applause from a distant world. At dawn, Captain Ritter called them together. His voice was hoarse. We hold this line, he said. The Americans won't cross the river. Hans stepped forward. Sir, they already did. The bridge was destroyed last night. The captain's hand trembled on his revolver. Then we fight without a bridge. With what? Hans asked. We've no ammunition left. Ritter's eyes darted from face to men who used to salute him, who now only stared with blank exhaustion. His lips moved, searching for words that had long ago lost their power. We fight, he said again, but the words were barely a whisper. Hans watched the man's shoulders slump. He looked smaller now, as though the uniform itself had begun to reject him. When Ritter turned away, Hans saw his hand brush the revolver again, not in command, but in despair. That night, no one guarded the line. Before dawn, Hans wrote once more in his notebook. They told us to die for Germany. But Germany died before we did. He closed it and tucked it inside his coat. Around him, the forest was quiet except for the wind moving through dead branches. Somewhere beyond the trees, an American engine rumbled, steady and calm. Ernst shivered beside him. Do you think they'll really treat us well? Hans looked at the boy. He still called him that in his mind, though war had aged him 10 years in one. I don't know, he said, but I'd rather take my chances with men than with ghosts. When the first light touched the frost, the decision came. They tore white strips from their shirts and tied them to the ends of their rifles. The flags of surrender fluttered like strange birds in the wind. No one spoke. They simply began to walk, through the trees, through the mud, through what was left of their war. The forest opened to a field where snow still lingered in the shadows. In the distance, shapes moved, American soldiers, cautious and watchful. Rifles raised but not firing. Hans took a deep breath. This is it. Ernst swallowed. Do we put our hands up? Just keep walking, Hans said. The Americans shouted something in English, the words lost in the wind. Then slowly they lowered their weapons. One of them, a tall man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, stepped forward. Hands up, he said, his German broken but clear. Hans lifted his arms. The others followed. The Americans studied them, not with hatred, but with the dull fatigue of someone who'd seen too much death to want more. He nodded once and gestured for them to move forward. Hans hesitated only a moment, then slung his rifle into the mud. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed in his chest like the breaking of a chain. When he finally met the American's eyes, he saw no triumph there, only relief. The man held out a cigarette. Smoke. Hans shook his head, then smiled faintly. Keep it. You look like you need it more. The American laughed softly, the first human sound Hans had heard in months. They began walking toward the rear lines, side by side, the white flags fluttering between them. For the first time since the war began, Hans felt light, as though he had finally stepped out from under a shadow too vast to understand. He looked back once, at the forest behind him, at the ruins of everything he had believed in. Maybe surrender isn't shame, he whispered. Maybe it's the first honest thing we've done. The wind carried his words away. And for a fleeting moment, the rain stopped. Snow drifted across the ruins of the forest road like gray ash. Hans Meyer trudged beside the column of half-frozen soldiers, his rifle slung uselessly on his shoulder, the bayonet long gone. Each man moved as if in a trance, boots slapping the ice, breath forming weak ghosts that vanished into the cold. The wind carried the faint metallic smell of old artillery smoke mixed with rot. They had been marching west for 3 days, following the rumor of an American line where prisoners were treated like men. No one really knew. Every kilometer felt like a wager against death. If the rumor was false, they would walk into Russian guns. If true, they might yet see another sunrise without the taste of iron in their mouths. At dusk, the column halted near an abandoned mill. Its water wheel was frozen mid-turn, a monument to things that had once moved. Hans crouched beside a broken wall and rubbed his hands over a small fire that a few men had dared to light. Sparks snapped in the wind. Fritz Keller, a former mechanic from Munich, huddled beside him. "You think they'll really take us alive, Hans?" he asked quietly. Hans watched the flames crawl over the wood. "They'll take us, yes. Whether we live afterward is another question." Keller gave a hollow laugh. "You sound like the chaplain." "The chaplain's dead," Hans said simply. "So someone has to speak the truth." Behind them, Sergeant Weiss argued with an officer about rations. The officer's voice broke, pleading for reason, while Weiss's tone was steady and low, the sound of someone who had lost too much to shout anymore. Hans drifted into memory. 2 years earlier, a farmhouse in Normandy. His unit had been chasing ghosts of resistance fighters when they stumbled upon a family hiding in a cellar. The mother's eyes had been full of terror, and the lieutenant had ordered them out at gunpoint. Hans had looked away as the rest of his squad set fire to the barn. Even now, the crackle of this small campfire carried the echo of that night. He whispered to himself, "No more fires." The night deepened. Someone began humming an old Bavarian song, slow and cracked, like the last note of a dying radio. One by one the men joined, their voices a thin thread of memory tying them to a life before the uniforms. Morning came pale and bitter. Word spread along the line that an American patrol had been sighted near a crossroads 2 kilometers ahead. Some soldiers cheered weakly, others tightened their grips on their rifles as if habit refused to die. Captain Vogel gathered them in the clearing. His coat hung heavy with frost, his breath pluming like smoke from an engine. "Men," he said, "we have a choice. The Russians will be on us within days. The Americans are advancing from the west. The High Command says we fight to the end. But the High Command is somewhere in Berlin, and we are here." Silence. Even the wind paused. "I will not order men to die for ghosts," Vogel continued. "If the Americans treat prisoners fairly, we walk to them. If they do not, at least we die with our hands raised, not in another senseless charge." A murmur ran through the group, fear, disbelief, relief. Hans looked at the faces around him, boys with hollow cheeks, old men with trembling hands, 1 or 2 who still clutched medals like talismans. None of them had any fight left. They wanted a bed, a piece of bread, a word that meant tomorrow. Keller nudged him. "You hear that? The captain's going to surrender us." Hans nodded. Maybe it's the first sane thing any officers said since this war began. The village of no flags. They reached a small village just after noon. Roofs were caved in, smoke curled from a single surviving chimney, and chickens scratched through the snow as if the world hadn't ended. A woman stepped out of a doorway holding a child wrapped in blankets. Her face was blank, drained of everything but the instinct to keep breathing. Vogel approached her slowly, hands raised. "We seek shelter," he said. "We will not harm you." The woman looked at the soldiers behind him, filthy, exhausted shadows of an army that had once terrified Europe. "You've already harmed enough," she murmured, then turned away. The men slept in barns and kitchens, grateful even for straw and silence. Hans lay awake staring at the rafters. Every creak sounded like a rifle bolt. Somewhere in the darkness Keller whispered a prayer, the kind men say when they no longer know to whom they are speaking. In the morning, Hans went to fetch water from the well and found a scrap of American newspaper pinned to the post. U.S. forces advance beyond Rhine, thousands of Germans surrender. The photograph showed lines of soldiers walking with hands raised, faces downcast, guarded by men in clean uniforms who offered cigarettes. He felt something break inside, not fear but a kind of weary hope. The surrender plan. Captain Vogel called the men together once more. "We march tonight," he said. "White cloths on your rifles. No weapons loaded. Anyone who fires will answer to me before God." The column began moving under a cold, starless sky. Every step sounded too loud. Hans's boots were soaked through, his toes numb. Around him men muttered prayers, names, fragments of songs. The fear was not of death anymore but of being misunderstood, shot by an American before they could raise their hands high enough. Near midnight they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Down below, flares burst silently over what looked like an American encampment. Vehicles moved like fireflies, organized, alive. Weiss whispered, "They look real. Not ghosts." "They're real enough to end this," Hans said. Vogel ordered a halt. "At first light," he said quietly, "we go down. Before dawn." Hans could not sleep. He sat on a fallen log, watching the eastern sky bleed from black to gray. Keller joined him, shivering. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" he asked. Hans shook his head. "No. Americans aren't like that." "How do you know?" "I don't," Hans admitted. "But I have to believe something." A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere a wolf howled. Keller laughed softly. "Even the animals are hungry for surrender." Hans smiled despite himself. "Then maybe there's still some sense left in the world." The descent. At dawn, the white flags rose. Torn bedsheets, shirts, handkerchiefs, all tied to sticks, waving weakly in the cold breeze. The men began their descent into the valley. Hans walked beside Captain Vogel, who carried no weapon. Ahead, the American camp grew larger, clear. Sandbags, jeeps, tents, and soldiers in helmets marked with a single white star. When they were within shouting distance, Vogel called out in English, halting but firm, "We are German soldiers. We surrender. Do not shoot." For a terrible moment nothing happened. Then a voice answered through a loudspeaker, rough but calm, "Advance slowly with your hands up. No weapons." The men obeyed. Rifles dropped into the snow. Hands rose. Hans's heart pounded as he stepped across an invisible line between war and something that might one day be called peace. The encounter. American soldiers emerged from behind sandbags, rifles at the ready. Their faces were wary but not hateful. One of them, a tall sergeant with a Texan drawl, approached Vogel. "You in charge?" "Yes," Vogel said. "My men will cause no trouble." The sergeant studied him a moment, then nodded. "Good. You're done fighting. Welcome to the end of the world." Keller exhaled sharply, half laugh, half sob. Someone behind him dropped to his knees, whispering thanks to a god he'd cursed an hour earlier. Hans watched as Americans handed out canteens, blankets, cigarettes. No cruelty. No shouting. Just the efficient, weary compassion of men who'd seen too much killing to find pride in victory. One American offered Hans a cigarette. "You boys had enough?" he asked. Hans took it with trembling fingers. "More than enough." They smoked in silence, the gray smoke mingling like a truce between ghosts. By nightfall the valley was filled with prisoners, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, sitting in the snow, guarded but unharmed. The Americans moved among them with lanterns, taking names, handing out bread. Hans lay back against a crate, staring at the stars. The war, for him, had ended not with a bang but with a surrender whispered into the morning air. He thought of the men who had chosen to keep fighting somewhere east, and he pitied them. Because surrender, he realized, was not weakness. It was the last act of courage left to those who had survived everything else. The valley had turned into a sea of gray uniforms. From the ridge above, it looked as if the earth itself had surrendered, 500,000 men pressed together, unarmed, waiting for orders that would never come. The morning fog rolled low, swallowing the outlines of tanks, trucks, and men until everything looked like ghosts moving through half-light. Hans Meyer sat with his back against a wooden fence, his helmet on the ground beside him. His hands, wrapped in bandages from frostbite, trembled each time he tried to hold the tin cup of watery coffee the Americans had given him. Around him, voices murmured, half German, half English, a strange new language of exhaustion. A young American private, barely more than a boy, walked past handing out bread. "You okay, buddy?" he asked when he saw Hans staring blankly ahead. Hans nodded. "Done." The boy smiled tiredly. "Aren't we all?" The camp of forgotten men. By evening, rows of barbed wire had gone up around the valley. The Germans were no longer soldiers. They were POWs, prisoners of a war that had already lost its purpose. The Americans worked methodically, building latrines, assigning rations, marking off zones. They moved with quiet professionalism, not cruelty. But the psychological weight of captivity pressed down like snow on a collapsing roof. Captain Vogel walked among his men, checking on the wounded, speaking softly. He carried himself with the same posture as before, but the shine of command was gone. Now he looked like a man stripped of everything except decency. When he reached Hans, he crouched beside him. "Do you regret it?" Vogel asked quietly. Hans thought for a long moment. "Regret what?" "Laying down arms." Hans's voice was a whisper. "No, Captain. For the first time in years, I feel human again." Vogel gave a faint smile. "Then perhaps surrender isn't defeat. Perhaps it's mercy, disguised." The American's eyes. The next day, an American journalist arrived at the camp. He was clean-shaven, his uniform crisp, his camera hanging like an extra limb. He walked through the rows of prisoners, clicking the shutter, click, 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 each sound stealing another piece of their dignity. 500,000, he muttered to a lieutenant beside him. "Can you believe that number? 500,000 men just gave up." The lieutenant shrugged. "They're tired of dying for Hitler. I'd do the same." When the journalist reached Hans's section, he raised his camera. "Look here," he said, "we need the world to see this." Hans turned his face away. The man hesitated, then lowered the camera. "You don't have to look ashamed," he said softly. "You made the smart choice." Hans looked up, his blue eyes hollow. "Smart," he repeated. "No one here feels smart." The journalist nodded, understanding something he couldn't print. Letters never sent. That night, the Americans distributed paper and pencils so the prisoners could write letters home. Hans sat beneath a flickering lamp and stared at the blank sheet for hours. Finally, he began to write. "Dear Anna, if this reaches you, know that I am alive. The Americans treat us fairly, better than we deserve, perhaps. I do not know what is left of Germany, or if there is still a home to return to. I have seen men give up everything but their breath. Yet somehow, that breath feels more precious now than all the medals we once dreamed of. If our son still remembers my face, tell him his father finally stopped fighting, not because he lost courage, but because he found it. Hans." He folded the letter carefully and handed it to an American clerk, who promised it would be sent when the postal routes reopened. Hans doubted it ever would. But writing it had been enough, like setting down a stone he had carried too long. Whispers of the East. Rumors drifted through the camp like cold wind. The Russians are taking no prisoners. They shoot anyone who doesn't drop their weapons fast enough. They send them to Siberia, to work camps, forever. Every man who heard those whispers thanked the gods, or fate, or simple chance that they had been captured by Americans instead of the Red Army. The horror stories spread faster than truth. One evening, Fritz Keller returned from talking with a guard, his face pale. "They said a whole German division tried to fight east of the Elbe," he said. "The Russians wiped them out. No survivors." Silence fell. Somewhere, a man began to cry quietly into his blanket. Hans closed his eyes and thought of those men, the ones who still believed fighting would buy them honor. They were gone now, swallowed by history's merciless appetite. "We lived," he said softly, "because we chose not to die." The price of survival. Weeks passed. Snow melted into mud. The Americans built larger camps farther west and began transferring prisoners. The German army no longer existed, not as a force, not as an idea. It was a scattered mass of men waiting for the world to decide what to do with them. One morning, Hans woke to find Captain Vogel standing over him, holding a folded note. "They're moving officers first," Vogel said. "I'll be sent away tomorrow." Hans rose slowly. "Where?" "France, maybe. They want to question us about war crimes, units, orders." He hesitated. "I told them you were only a corporal. You'll be fine." Hans swallowed hard. "And you, Captain?" Vogel smiled faintly. "Every man must answer for something, Hans. I only hope they ask the right questions." They clasped hands, soldier to soldier, no ranks left between them. "Thank you," Hans said quietly, "for letting us live." Vogel looked toward the horizon where the American flag fluttered over the valley. "We all chose life, Meyer. The trick is learning what to do with it now." The last march. Days later, Hans and the others were herded onto trucks heading west toward a larger camp. The road wound through villages reduced to rubble. Churches without roofs, schools without children, roads lined with tanks turned to rusting skeletons. As they passed one crossroads, Hans saw a sign hammered into a tree by an American soldier, "Road to Peace, 10 kilometers." He stared at it for a long time, as if those words could erase everything that had come before. Keller, sitting beside him, whispered, "Do you think there'll be peace, Hans?" Hans's gaze didn't move from the sign. "Not yet," he said. "But maybe this is where it begins." The truck rumbled on. Behind them, the Valley of Surrender faded into the mist, its countless footprints filling slowly with rain. Years later, 10 years passed. In a quiet town on the Rhine, Hans Meyer worked as a mechanic, fixing engines for American cars now sold to Germans who once feared the sound of their engines. He had married again, not Anna, who never returned from Dresden, but a kind nurse named Clara. Their son, Peter, played in the yard with a wooden plane carved from an old rifle stock. Sometimes Hans would stop at the edge of the yard and watch the boy. The laughter, the open sky, the sound of life beginning again, all of it felt fragile, miraculous. At night, when the world was quiet, he would take out a small tin box from under his bed. Inside were 3 things. The letter he had written in the American camp, unsent. A rusted medal he no longer cared about. A white scrap of cloth, torn from the bedsheet they had used as a surrender flag. He would hold that cloth and remember the morning when he and 500,000 others had chosen not to die. And every time he looked at it, he knew he had made the only choice that truly mattered.